Well, I'm here in Tianjin, China, trying turtle. This is with apologies to Turtley, my pet turtle. Tastes like chicken. In the summer of 2018, I traveled to Tianjin, China. That's here, to volunteer at a children's home with a group. As part of this trip, I hoped to explore as much of China's railway network as possible. Since this was before I made train videos here on Classy Whale, I unfortunately never documented the adventure as well as I could have, but I thought today it would be fun to share my experience and footage from China, and to take a look at what we could learn from their rail system. My group in 2018 was absolutely amazing, and that more than made up for the fact that they prioritized seeing important cultural sites over riding fast trains. That meant that taking high-speed rail wasn't in the cards. But at the very least, our team leader ended up planning a trip into downtown Tianjin on a slow intercity train. I was, of course, ecstatic. Tianjin itself is kind of a city-state, akin to Washington, D.C., and we were on the very edge of it, so our closest station was in the nearby city of Langfang, called Langfang North. This was once Langfang's main station, simply bearing the city's name. North, or Bay in Chinese, was slapped onto the name when the high-speed Beijing-Shanghai corridor was constructed, with the shiny new high-speed station now taking the city's name. As soon as we got out of our taxi, several things stood out about the station, which would turn out to be, to varying degrees, typical of every station I visited in China. The ticket offices faced outside, rather than serving the interior of the station. You'd stand in line under an awning to buy your tickets, and when you got to the front of the line, you'd have to show your passport in order to purchase transportation. Interestingly, it seems like the children's fare was based strictly on height. The station itself was pretty average, built more for function than form. On the outside, there were all sorts of shops selling snacks and such, as well as enormous areas for bike and motorbike parking, at least enormous by American standards. To enter the station itself, you'd have to pass through a metal detector and get your bag scanned. The inside was also pretty nondescript, but at least I could catch a glimpse of a few trains from the windows. It seemed like some of the trains used bi-level cars, but unfortunately I never got to see inside one. We walked out to the platform, and I was treated to an oddly familiar sight. A wide, multi-tracked electrified main line bearing striking resemblance to the Northeast Corridor back home. But beyond that, elevated somewhat, were an additional 2 tracks for the new high-speed line. Langfang was a smaller city, so only the local high-speed services stopped there. That meant that within minutes of walking out to the platform, there was a distant rumble, then a flash of white and gold as an express train shot past us before disappearing just as quickly as it appeared. This was a train unlike anything I had ever seen or felt before, and I knew that someday I had to experience it for myself. But more about that later. In the meantime, as we waited, another unfamiliar sight greeted me. Electrified mainline freight. And not just a little local train either. This one had a freaking tank on it. With passenger volumes on the conventional line dropping in the wake of the high-speed line's opening, freight was beginning to run more and more often on the main line. Then, at last, it was time for our train. A bright red 6-axle locomotive pulled into the station, dragging a seemingly endless train of green and yellow coaches behind it. We climbed aboard and settled in. The seats were in a 3-2 configuration and did not recline, and while the legroom wasn't awful, a lot of seats had you seated across from strangers go transit style. Once in motion, we paralleled the high-speed route for a bit, then turned eastward, passing all sorts of trains, ranging from freight trains to express package cars to stored sleeping cars. After an hour's time and one very, very long stop, we arrived in Tianjin Central Station, a distance of just shy of 40 miles. The massive train hall also served the Beijing-Tianjin Intercity Railway, a high-speed commuter service between its namesake cities, and one of China's oldest high-speed railways. We passed through an exit hall and out into the main plaza in front of the station. This design would turn out to be fairly typical of Chinese stations, with distinct facilities for ticketing, boarding, and exiting into the city. I'm not certain, but I would guess that this is for efficiency, as upwards of 2 billion passenger trips are made on China railways every year, and you've got to keep the crowds moving. After exploring Tianjin, we headed back to the station for our return train. This station had a newer look compared to Langfang North, with modern, airport-esque glass and steel construction, and some people had brought mats to sit or lie on while waiting for their trains. My teammate and I sat across from a Chinese mother and daughter on the return journey. Once the train was in motion, mother and daughter produced a wrapped package of some kind of seasoned or dried meat, donned thin plastic gloves, and began happily picking away at it. As we rode, more high-speed trains passed us, and I remarked to my teammate, "That is the future." At least, it was my future. The next year, I returned to the children's home as a solo intern. That gave me a lot more opportunities to explore China's railways. I finally got to try China's bullet trains on the second weekend of the trip, once again traveling from Langfang to Tianjin, but this time using the fancy Langfang high-speed station. This station shared Tianjin's sweeping, airy design, and it came complete with a massive concrete plaza in the front. For my first ride, I decided to splurge on business class, which if I remember correctly cost something like $8 for such a short trip, $2 less than a weekend pass on the MBTA commuter rail back home. My ticket came complete with lounge access, which meant a separate seating area with free beverages. The train itself had business class compartments at the front and rear of every train set, right near the cab. And as I would find out, this wasn't Amtrak's sort of business class, with somewhat slightly nicer seats. No, this was a full-on lie-flat recliner with amazing legroom, if you were the height of an average Chinese person at least. As the train began to shoot down the track, quickly reaching 180 miles per hour, a car attendant came by, gave me a box of snacks for my ride, and brought me a glass of water. This whole compartment was separated by a bulkhead from the rest of the train, and there were only about 6 seats, so I felt like a member of a very exclusive club. Only 20 minutes later, we were slowing down into Tianjin, and I stepped off into the rather nondescript Tianjin South Station. Interestingly, as is the case in some Chinese cities along main lines, this station was far from downtown, requiring a metro ride as long as the train ride to reach the city's core. I don't have any pictures of Tianjin's metro, but I will say that it was the most boring metro I have ever ridden. Every station looked exactly alike, and the area it seemed to run through felt like what the youths are calling liminal space. Endless flatness with the occasional building stretching off into nothing. At the very least, this was the only subway I've ever ridden that used tokens, specifically plastic tokens containing a value chip similar to a smart card that you'd either tap on the fare machines or insert into a slot. My Chinese fellow intern Murray joined me on this adventure, riding in first class instead of business, and we met up with a few other interns downtown. When it came time for us to book our return tickets, all the high-speed trains had sold out, so we booked the slow train back to Langfang. In the process of booking, Murray asked me if I'd like to return in a sleeper car, to which I enthusiastically responded, yes. I ended up in a hard sleeper, which was arranged a bit like a hostel, with bunks stacked 3 high and small tables along the aisle. Privacy was essentially non-existent. The ride was a bit confusing, as I'm sure the car attendants weren't sure why I was riding such a short distance in a sleeper, and I got out of bed multiple times to try to figure out where they were expecting me to wait to get off. Still, I got to experience a sleeping car experience for at least a short while, and I beat miles in transit to doing this kind of trip by almost 2 years. The next day, I got to visit Beijing by train. After an inbound trip on the slow train and a day full of exploring and spending way too much at the Pearl Market, Murray and I headed to the truly gargantuan Beijing South Station, where I got to try a unique vending machine that would make fresh squeezed orange juice from actual oranges. Heading down to the platform, Murray and I discovered that we would be riding a Fuxing train set, which Murray proudly described as a second-generation train built and developed entirely within China. This was in contrast to previous designs, which were based on foreign trains. 1 weekend later, I was back in Beijing to visit the city's railway museum. While the main museum campus was on the outskirts of the city, they had an additional campus near the National Museum, which I was also aiming to visit. I happened to buy a model of the museum when I was in the gift shop, so let me show you what's interesting architecturally about it. This used to be Beijing's downtown train station, but this whole piece was over here. It was destroyed when the subway was constructed, leaving only the clock tower. It was then meticulously rebuilt, in a mirror image of the original, over here when it became a museum. While it only held one actual locomotive, it also featured models of famous equipment and the occasional artifact. On the return journey, my fellow intern and I took business class again, and I've got to say, Beijing South's lounge had much better amenities than Langfang, including a hot chocolate machine. My Beijing travels also featured the city's metro, which had airport-style security at every entrance, platform screen doors retrofitted even into the smallest Mao-era stations, and the most insane crowding of any transit vehicle I've ever ridden. Thus far, all of my adventures on China's railways had been short hops between Langfang and the 2 nearest megacities, distances smaller than Boston to Providence. But now it was time for a longer adventure. I joined a team from the children's home, visiting an orphanage in the south of the country to deliver supplies and disability training, and our mode of transport was once again high-speed rail. While I'm not at liberty to disclose exactly where we went, all I can say is that they drink kudzu tea there. The distance was like traveling from Boston to Atlanta, even though the trip took only 8 hours. Only here is of course relative. My internship supervisor warned that visits like this could involve really long train rides, and I had to remind myself that normal people probably wouldn't ride the California Zephyr for fun. Starting in Langfang, we flew along viaducts over flat farmland for the first few hours, some of which were among the largest bridges in the world, running upwards of 75 miles in length. I was encouraged to pack instant ramen noodles for the ride, as there was a small spigot for hot water in each car. One of the Chinese staffers also packed us all typical train snacks, including a custard pie, a preserved hard-boiled egg, and an entire cucumber. I ate all of these and thoroughly enjoyed them. As time passed, the land got hillier until we were shooting through the mountains. Unlike the California Zephyr, however, our train didn't wind around mountains and naturally occurring valleys. Rather, it shot straight through the range using alternating bridges and tunnels. This was high-speed rail pushed to its absolute limits, and I would have thoroughly enjoyed it if the seat I was on had a bit more cushion. As it was, my rear end was hurting by the time we got off the train. I would later discover that just steps from the Langfang station platforms, there was a small alley full of restaurants and shops. I remember seeing a monkey in a cage outside of one store, and based on the stares I got, I don't think white people ventured down there very often. My fellow intern and I met a woman playing a Chinese zither in one shop, and she let us have a go at playing it, showed us her instrument collection, and even told us where the nearest music store was. I'm very glad my fellow intern spoke Chinese on this outing. Before I finish my train stories, I'd like to give an honorable mention to Chinese microtransit. I had a couple opportunities to experience tuk-tuks, which I barely fit into, and once I actually got to drive one, which was fun. Also, at least in the newer built sprawl outside of urban cores, Chinese stroads had some of the most hardcore bike lanes I've ever seen, with whole plant-filled barricades between them and the main road. These were, however, shared between pedal bikes and motorbikes, but then again, these were the smaller sort of motorbikes. Also, I realized while I was editing this that I forgot to mention I rode in Melania Trump's cable car at the Great Wall of China, so fun fact. Anyway, my final ride on China Railways was the G79, an express high-speed train from Beijing west to Hong Kong. This was the fastest train I'd ever ridden in China, and in my life until that point. And while it took 9 hours to make the trip, passing through cities such as Wuhan and Changsha, it felt like only minutes had passed when we began coasting through the Pearl River Delta, before plunging into a tunnel that took us straight into central Hong Kong. Interestingly, the station platform area is legislated as mainland Chinese territory, despite being directly underneath the city, and I had to clear passport control to enter what billed itself as Asia's World City. Hong Kong was fun to explore. I found the MTR to be a lot more fun than Beijing or Tianjin's metros, with shopping arcades and convenience stores in every station, and the Octopus card payment system was cross-compatible not only with the rest of the city's transit, but also with most restaurants and businesses as well. Throughout my time, I got to experience the Tengchong cable car, the Star Ferry, and a plethora of double-decker trams and buses. I also got sushi delivered to me on a train. Being in China meant that for the most part I was quite a bit taller than the people around me, so it was a little annoying when I rode the Victoria Peak tram only to find the overlook full of Dutch people, who are some of the tallest in the world. My final Chinese transit adventure was taking a coach bus across the Hong Kong-Macau-Zhuhai Bridge, a 30-mile bridge and tunnel complex connecting Hong Kong and the former Portuguese colony of Macau. It felt odd to take a decently long coach bus journey, almost the length of my Langfang to Tianjin trips, and to just be looking out the window at water the entire way. Interestingly, this bridge has cars driving on the right, like in mainland China, even though Hong Kong and Macau drive on the left. And that was pretty much it for my transit adventures in China. The next morning, I flew to South Korea and spent a week there. This included a DMZ tour featuring a bullet-riddled steam locomotive, a station constructed in the hope of a future open rail link between South Korea and North Korea, a tourist train that would take Koreans to the DMZ for tours, and the rare opportunity to technically stand on North Korean soil in the joint security area. I had planned a third trip to East Asia for my junior year of college, featuring trains across Vietnam, the 12-hour longest high-speed rail journey in China, and a ride on the Shanghai Maglev, but then COVID happened and that was the end of that. I'm not sure if a return to China is in the cards for me at the moment, but I think it might be fun to go back someday. In the meantime, here are a few takeaways I had from my experience riding the rails in the Middle Kingdom. Number 1. High-speed regional trains are a thing. As you may recall, I encountered the Beijing-Tianjin Intercity Railway in Tianjin's downtown station. This pioneering line runs just 72 miles between the aforementioned cities. Once the line was complete, China had the proof of concept they needed to build longer lines to Shanghai and beyond. Perhaps rather than jumping right into statewide corridors, America should follow suit and build shorter high-speed lines for local travel, say between Los Angeles and San Diego, or Philadelphia and New York. Brightline's southern section between West Palm Beach and Miami is a similar length to the Beijing-Tianjin line, and even though it's conventional rail rather than high-speed, it's already turning a profit even without an extension to Orlando. I think our model of high-speed rail is very rooted in longer intercity travel, and China shows us it doesn't have to be that way. Number 2. Stations in the urban core are important. One annoying aspect of China's network is that sometimes stations were miles away from their city cores, at distances similar to airports, requiring lengthy metro rides to get downtown. While this created straighter rights of way and allowed for cheaper construction and larger facilities, it did take away from the convenience of train travel. At the end of the day, rail is always going to be slower than air, and its main advantage is convenience. Unfortunately, plans for Brightline West and Texas High-Speed Rail have both featured stations in sprawly suburbs, and it seems like we're doomed to repeat this pattern. Number 3. Stations can be common spaces. Many of the stations I visited had massive concrete plazas in front of them, sometimes complete with public art or topiary. In the evening, these lit up as vibrant city parks, with children playing and adults doing group line dances and singing karaoke. Coming out of the Langfang station after a day trip, I would sometimes join them in these activities. The railway created a common space, and people were keen to use that space. Contrast that with Lancaster's Amtrak station, which simply has a parking lot in front. Common spaces are key to good urbanism, and tying them to trains is even better. Number 4. Stations need a soul. One advantage Lancaster Station has over Langfang Station is its artistry. Many of the older Chinese stations I visited were simplistic structures, which just seemed to exist to serve their purpose. Newer stations, constructed en masse in just the last 2 decades or so, featured big glass and steel spaces with lots of curves. And while at first I found them impressive, I soon realized that there was something missing in this style. Each station had the exact same feel and color palette to it, and after a while, the grandeur of the buildings wore off, replaced with a dull, sterile soullessness. Compare that to something like Union Station in Washington, D.C., or St. Pancras in London, both of which were individually designed to feel like something, giving them a sense of place. And lest you think I'm bashing modern or non-Western design, take a look at Morocco. They rebuilt many of their stations recently, and while they achieved the grandeur of China's stations, they also incorporated plenty of traditional designs from Morocco's rich history. I remember these more vividly than anything I experienced in China. Perhaps the next generation of Beijing stations can take inspiration from the Forbidden Palace grounds, the Drum and Bell Towers, the Temple of Heaven, and other local landmarks, while retaining their massive, modern magnificence. Number 5. Cheap sleeper trains are cool. Yeah, the bunk-style sleeping car I rode in didn't give much privacy or space, but it was cheap. And privacy wasn't that much different than sitting in a car full of seated passengers. If Amtrak wants to appeal to budget travelers, it could do well to install a few of these bunks in their Amfleets or Superliners. Then again, Amtrak seats are so much more comfortable than anything on China railways, so it might not make much difference. And number 6, trains provide options. More important than any tourism or adventures, trains open up the world to people who have a genuine need to get places. When I sent my internship supervisor the script for this video, she pointed out that trains are a lifeline during Chinese holidays, especially National Day and Lunar New Year. These are both long holiday breaks, allowing time for travel, and railroads provide options for families to connect with loved ones, especially people with middle and lower income. Some people save for an entire year just to ride the trains, and they allow you to transport certain items that would be forbidden or limited on planes, like produce. Additionally, when the children's home I was at opened an outpatient therapy clinic, some families would travel from across the country just to be able to take their kids to physical and occupational therapy services. The clinic provided the therapy, and the railways provided the transportation. Before I finish this video, I'd like to give a shout out to everyone who made my China adventures as wonderful as they were, including Murray, who got to experience Amtrak last year when he visited the States. Link to that is in the top left corner. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this different sort of video. I'm going to be doing a Boston area subscriber meetup on May 27th. We're going to be riding the SL3 and the Columbus Avenue bus lanes to see which Boston BRT is better, and we'll also be riding the Mattapan high-speed line and looking at why it's a PCC line and not anything else. We might also do some other stuff depending on how much time there is left, and we'll finish up the day with some delicious Ethiopian food. Hope to see you there. Sign up is in the description. Take care. This is a grasshopper. I'm going to eat this. How it taste? Not that great.